Rhine River, Germany, March 1945. The air hung thick with smoke and frost. On the western bank, American spotlights cut through the night, glinting off broken steel and black water. The bridges ahead were gone, twisted skeletons of iron scattered across the current, blown apart by retreating German engineers only hours before. From the far shore, German officers watched through binoculars, convinced that the Americans would halt for days. The Rhine had always been their greatest natural fortress, wide, cold, and merciless. But what they saw next left them silent. Under artillery flashes, U.S. combat engineers rolled trucks into the mud, unloading metal panels and timber beams. Floodlights snapped on. Welding sparks lit up the dark like fireflies. Men in drenched uniforms hammered, hauled, and bolted through the night. Engines roared. Steel groaned. By dawn, where ruin had stood, a new bridge was rising, a lattice of iron and will. Trucks lined up, tanks rumbled forward, and the impossible had been crossed. On the eastern shore, a German major lowered his binoculars and whispered, "Unmöglich." Impossible. But it was already too late. The Americans had turned destruction into a doorway. In early 1945, Germany's western frontier was collapsing, but its engineers still believed the Rhine would save them. The river had always been more than geography. It was a symbol of defense, a moat guarding the heart of the Reich. Across centuries of invasion, the Rhine stood as Germany's last and greatest line. Now, as Allied armies advanced from France and Belgium, German High Command issued a single desperate order: destroy every bridge. From Cologne to Wesel, from Remagen to Mannheim, steel arches and stone crossings fell in thunderous cascades. Explosive charges shattered foundations that had stood for generations. Towns were cut off, civilians stranded. But in the logic of total war, delay meant survival. Each bridge blown was meant to buy time, days, perhaps weeks, for regrouping, for one last stand inside the fatherland. The Wehrmacht's engineers were experts at destruction. They had mapped every bridge months in advance, set charges with clinical precision, and even wired secondary detonations to ensure total collapse. When the last spans plunged into the Rhine, they were confident. No army could cross that torrent quickly. But across the river, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was preparing to prove them wrong. Since North Africa, American engineer battalions had become the silent spearhead of every advance. They were not glamorous units, no parades, no headlines, yet without them, no army moved. Their job was movement itself: roads, bridges, water supply, mine sweeping, and the endless repair of war's destruction. By 1945, they had evolved into one of the most efficient engineering forces in military history. Each combat engineer carried more than a rifle. They carried blueprints, wrenches, demolition cord, and the stubborn certainty that no obstacle was permanent. Behind them were convoys of trucks loaded with the most ingenious weapon of mobility ever designed: the Bailey Bridge, invented by British engineer Donald Bailey and adopted by the U.S. Army. It was the miracle structure of the war, a modular steel bridge assembled like a giant Meccano set. No cranes, no factories, just manpower, muscle, and math. Panels could be carried by 6 men, locked together with pins, and launched across rivers in record time. To the Germans, who relied on heavy machinery and long construction schedules, the Bailey Bridge seemed almost magical. To the Americans, it was simply procedure. In the weeks leading to March 1945, Allied reconnaissance photographed every remaining bridge site. Engineer battalions were attached to each army group: Hoge's 1st Army, Patton's 3rd, and Montgomery's 21st. Their orders: reach the Rhine, and no matter what they found, build a way across. When German bridges began to fall, the Americans didn't stop. They accelerated. Pontoons were prepared. Floating treadways stacked. Bulldozers and cranes moved ahead with the infantry. The Rhine's destruction wasn't a barrier. It was an invitation. And when the first German officers peered through their binoculars that cold March night, they weren't watching soldiers in retreat. They were witnessing a new kind of warfare, where engineering, not artillery, would decide who controlled the continent. The river that once divided Europe was about to be crossed not by luck or chance, but by calculation, sweat, and the relentless will to build under fire. By late February 1945, the Rhine had become both a symbol and a test. For the Germans, it represented their last natural shield. For the Allies, it was the final obstacle before the heart of Germany, the gateway to victory. Both sides understood what it meant. Whoever controlled the crossings would control the future. German commanders assumed that destruction would slow the Americans for weeks. Their engineers had flooded riverbanks, mined approaches, and prepared artillery to hammer any attempted crossing. They believed that logistics, not courage, would halt the Allies, but they underestimated one of America's most overlooked advantages, the scale and precision of its engineering machine. From the beaches of Normandy to the mountains of Italy, U.S. engineers had turned impossible landscapes into open roads. Now, along the Rhine, they brought that same discipline. Armies moved with prefabricated steel sections, pontoon boats, amphibious DUKWs, and floating cranes. Every piece was part of a vast logistical choreography that stretched all the way back to factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh. When a bridge fell, the replacement was already rolling forward by convoy. Every hour mattered, not for prestige, but for survival. The faster armor and supplies crossed, the sooner the German defense would crack. In the north, Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group prepared its assault at Wesel, supported by British and American engineers. In the center, General Hoge's First Army advanced toward Remagen. And in the south, Patton's Third Army, known for speed, demanded the impossible, to cross the Rhine within days of reaching it. Behind each plan stood the engineers. Their methods were brutal in efficiency. First, reconnaissance scouts surveyed both banks under fire. Then, heavy bulldozers cleared wreckage and leveled the approaches. Next came the pontoons, floating sections lashed together by hand, anchored against the current, each loaded with Bailey Bridge panels waiting to launch. Men worked knee-deep in icy water, their breath forming clouds in the floodlights. They labored without pause, often for 20 hours straight. To an outside observer, it looked like madness, building under artillery fire, welding under the glare of searchlights, with shells landing yards away. But the engineers knew that hesitation was death. If the Germans saw movement stop, they'd know they were winning. Reports from German units described the moment disbelief set in. At Wesel, officers watched through rangefinders as American bridging crews assembled sections faster than artillery could destroy them. Every time a span collapsed, another was rising in its place. One German after-action report called it construction under impossible fire, as if they worked without fear. That resilience became the defining feature of the campaign. Americans didn't just cross rivers, they crossed time itself, turning what should have been weeks of delay into hours of progress. The Rhine crossings would soon become legend, feats of speed and ingenuity that stunned even the most hardened enemy engineers. For the Germans, it marked the moment they realized that destruction could no longer stop the tide. For the Americans, it was proof that engineering could win wars as decisively as any gun. And for history, it was the night the impossible bridge began to rise. The human angle every bridge began with men, not machines. They were ordinary soldiers trained to do extraordinary things under unthinkable pressure. Combat engineers slept little, ate less, and carried tools heavier than rifles. They were the first to step forward when everything in front of them was destroyed. At the Rhine, they worked in freezing water, their boots filled with mud, hands torn from handling steel girders, slick with oil. When artillery struck nearby, they didn't flinch. They counted seconds between shells, measuring when it was safe to hammer again. A Bailey panel weighed nearly 600 pounds. 6 men would lift it together, muscles shaking, while others guided pins through the holes with sledgehammers. Every clang echoed down the riverbanks, a defiant rhythm of progress against destruction. Officers wrote that morale remained strangely high. Men joked between bursts of gunfire. They lit cigarettes from welding torches, called coffee liquid armor, and said that a bridge built under fire holds stronger. They believed it because they had to. When daylight came, their faces were blackened with soot, their uniforms stiff with mud. But as tanks rolled over their handiwork, they'd watch in silence, knowing their exhaustion had turned into movement. Movement that carried an army across a river no one was supposed to cross. These weren't soldiers chasing glory. They were builders carving a path through chaos, and in that relentless drive, they embodied something deeper than courage. The quiet heroism of those who rebuild what war destroys. 2. The tactical angle in modern warfare. Time is everything. For every hour a bridge stood, divisions advanced. For every hour it didn't, an entire front stalled. German commanders knew it. That's why they destroyed every crossing along the Rhine. They hoped the Americans would stop, reorganize, and spend weeks constructing new spans. But U.S. combat engineers had refined a system that turned impossibility into routine. Tactical bridging had become an art of speed and precision. Each unit carried prefabricated components on trucks, arranged by sequence, like a moving assembly line in combat boots. Within minutes of reaching a riverbank, they could unload pontoons, anchor them with cables, and begin linking panels in a synchronized rhythm. The Bailey Bridge allowed them to build without cranes or heavy scaffolds. Panels were hand-locked, floors laid down, and decked with timber planks before the next section rolled forward. When finished, a 200-foot span could carry 40-ton tanks, all constructed in less than a day. This speed was more than efficiency. It was psychological warfare. Every time a bridge rose from ruin, it told the Germans their efforts were meaningless, no matter how many explosions they triggered. The Americans would cross again and again until resistance crumbled. The Rhine crossings, particularly at Wesel and Oppenheim, demonstrated this perfectly. Patton's engineers built a 200-foot bridge in just 10 hours under shellfire. It was a tactical miracle that allowed the Third Army to surge into Central Germany days ahead of schedule. For the enemy, it wasn't just defeat in battle. It was the collapse of confidence itself. The U.S. Army had turned logistics into a weapon, using organization and manpower to break the myth of the impassable river. The technological, logistical angle behind the heroism was design, precise, modular, brilliant. The Bailey Bridge, conceived in 1940, was the product of pure engineering elegance. It could be assembled anywhere, by anyone, with no special tools. Each rectangular panel fit perfectly into another, like a metallic puzzle. Its strength came from simplicity, geometry, not bulk. The Americans adapted it for every terrain. Floating bridges on pontoons, double and triple truss versions for tanks, even quick replacements for rail lines. One engineer joked, "Give me enough panels and I'll bridge the Atlantic." What made it revolutionary wasn't just portability. It was the logistical system behind it. Entire trains and convoys carried spare parts. Repair depots could fabricate missing components within hours. From factory to front line, the supply chain worked like a heartbeat. This efficiency turned engineering into a form of warfare that the Germans couldn't match. While the Wehrmacht's bridges relied on skilled labor and scarce materials, America's were industrial miracles in boxes. When one was destroyed, another was already on the way. The river may have divided nations, but for U.S. engineers, it was just another equation: length, load, current, time. And every time they solved it, the German line moved backward. They didn't just rebuild what was lost. They redefined how modern armies move: fast, flexible, unstoppable. Not chief. The leadership, command, angle, great engineering doesn't happen without leadership that believes in the impossible. In the spring of 1945, U.S. generals like Omar Bradley, George S. Patton, and William Hoge didn't simply order crossings. They lived among the men who built them. They knew that every delay, every cracked girder could cost hundreds of lives. General Patton, impatient and aggressive, embodied that urgency. When he reached the Rhine near Oppenheim on March 22, 1945, he refused to wait for official orders. He told his staff, "Let's get across before they blow it." Within hours, his engineers of the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion were in the water, anchoring pontoons under moonlight. By morning, Patton himself was across, standing on German soil, grinning into history. His army had built a bridge over one of the world's most defended rivers in a single night. General William Hoge, commander of the 9th Armored Division, faced the opposite moment, a miracle. Not of construction, but survival. At Remagen, his men captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact before German engineers could detonate it. It was a fluke of timing, but Hoge turned it into opportunity. Under continuous fire, his engineers reinforced the damaged structure while tanks thundered across. When the bridge finally collapsed 10 days later, thousands of troops were already east of the Rhine, and 3 replacement bridges were being built beside it. For commanders like Hoge and Patton, engineers were not background support. They were the vanguard. They fought with hammers, cables, and raw determination, proving that leadership wasn't about standing behind men. It was about moving with them. Across rivers, under fire, into history. The enemy POV angle from the German side, the view was one of disbelief turning to despair. For months, they had destroyed everything that connected east and west. Railways, roads, and bridges, believing it would cripple the Allies. Instead, they watched American engineers erase their work overnight. Captured reports from Wehrmacht engineering units reveal astonishment at the speed of U.S. reconstruction. One German colonel near Wesel wrote, "Their bridge rose in a single night. Ours, with 10 times the labor, took weeks." Another commented bitterly, "They build like machines. Even our artillery cannot stop them." German radio communications described entire divisions stranded because their own demolitions had trapped them on the wrong bank, while American units surged forward on fresh-built spans. German officers struggled to regroup amid chaos of their own making. The psychological blow was immense. For men trained to see engineering as a discipline of precision and perfection, watching their enemy rebuild faster than they could destroy was intolerable. In interrogation reports after the war, several German officers admitted that the American approach, decentralized, adaptive, relentless, was something their own system could never replicate. One simply said, "They had more bridges in their minds than we had on maps." That sentence captured the essence of the turning point. German engineering had been about control. American engineering was about momentum, and momentum wins wars. The moral philosophical angle war is destruction by nature. Yet, here were men fighting it by building. Every bridge across the Rhine was an act of defiance, not only against the enemy, but against war itself. It was proof that civilization still had craftsmen, not just killers. For the engineers, the mission carried a strange duality. They built so that others could advance and kill. Yet the act of building was inherently human, restorative, constructive. They turned broken landscapes into pathways, chaos into order. German civilians watching from ruined towns saw something they hadn't expected from an invading army: creation. The Americans didn't just cross, they rebuilt. And in that rebuilding, they showed what kind of power had arrived, one that conquered not only through weapons, but through will and intellect. When the dust settled, those bridges remained, standing as monuments to endurance. They connected more than 2 banks of a river. They connected 2 worlds of thought, one that sought safety in destruction, and another that found victory in creation. History would remember the guns and the generals, but it was the builders who truly crossed the Rhine, not just in steel, but in spirit. March 7, 1945, the Rhine front, near Remagen. Afternoon light flickered through smoke as American scouts advanced cautiously down the riverbank. They had expected the last bridge to be gone, reduced to twisted rebar and ash like all the rest. But through binoculars, they saw the impossible. The Ludendorff Bridge still standing. It was battered, blackened, and mined, but intact. The retreating German engineers had failed to detonate it in time. Their charges were damp, their timing circuits faulty. For a moment, the greatest river in Germany lay open before the U.S. First Army. General William Hoge of the 9th Armored Division wasted no time. He ordered his men forward. Infantry sprinted onto the bridge, bullets whining from the opposite bank. German machine guns opened up. Mortars rained down. The entire span shook under their boots. But momentum carried them forward. Within minutes, a full company had crossed the Rhine, the first Allied troops to do so in the war. For the German command, it was a nightmare unfolding in real time. Reports reached headquarters in Bonn. Americans across the Rhine at Remagen. Officers refused to believe it. Hitler, informed hours later, exploded in rage, accusing his engineers of treason. He ordered their immediate execution and demanded that the bridge be destroyed at any cost, by bombing, artillery, or suicide commandos. But it was too late. Even as German aircraft screamed overhead, U.S. engineers were already reinforcing the bridge with steel beams and pontoons. Every time a section buckled, they welded it back together under fire. Every night, they worked by flare light, deafened by artillery, half-blinded by smoke. Onlookers described it as a construction site inside a battlefield, a world where every hammer blow echoed like defiance. The Germans threw everything they had at the Ludendorff, 75 aircraft, 11 V-2 rockets, even underwater saboteurs. None succeeded. For 10 days, the bridge endured. Trains and tanks rumbled across, while shells exploded around them. Engineers patched, braced, and rewired the structure constantly. Finally, on March 17th, the Ludendorff collapsed into the river with a roar. By then, more than 25,000 Allied troops had already crossed into Germany, and on both banks, new bridges were already rising. To the Germans who watched it fall, it wasn't victory, it was revelation. They realized that America's strength wasn't in luck or machinery alone, but in relentlessness. Destruction, no matter how precise, could no longer stop progress. One captured German engineer later said, "We destroyed the bridge, but not their will." That line would echo long after the war, a confession carved from defeat. The Rhine had been Germany's shield for 1,000 years. In 10 days, it became the Allies' highway, and behind every crossing stood men in muddy uniforms holding blueprints instead of bayonets, building victory one rivet at a time. The bridge had fallen, but the crossing had already changed history. When the Ludendorff Bridge finally gave way, the river swallowed its wreckage, but not the momentum it had unleashed. Within hours, engineers along the Rhine received new orders, build replacements. Immediately, they didn't mourn the collapse. They prepared. At Remagen, Oppenheim, and Wesel, the sound of construction became the new artillery. Engines roared, chains clattered. Floodlights illuminated banks once thought untouchable. Hundreds of combat engineers, soaked, sleep-deprived, unshaven, went to work like men possessed. In the roar of air raids and the hiss of rain, they measured, aligned, and bolted their way across the river. The most astonishing feat came at Oppenheim. There, Patton's Third Army arrived on March 22, 1945, before the Germans could even react. His engineers, the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion, began anchoring pontoon. The current was fierce, the banks steep, but they moved with clockwork rhythm. By 2100 hours, the 1st Infantry were crossing on rafts. By dawn, a full bridge stretched from shore to shore, 1,280 feet of steel and timber, built in under 10 hours. German artillery found the site by sunrise and began shelling. Shells landed in the river, geysers of mud and spray rising among the pontoons. But the engineers didn't stop. They replaced broken cables, shoved wrecked sections back into place, and worked through the explosions. A journalist watching from the Western Bank wrote, "They built like men who didn't know they were being fired upon." By morning, Patton stood on the Eastern Bank, grinning as tanks rolled past him. He famously telegraphed headquarters, "Dear Ike, I've just crossed the Rhine with no opposition. There are so many bridges now, I could swim across dry." To the Germans, the news spread like a contagion of despair. Bridge after bridge, once symbols of defense, were reappearing, in defiance of their destruction. Even the Luftwaffe's dwindling aircraft couldn't stem the tide. Each time a span was bombed, engineers built another. Each time the river swallowed steel, more floated down from depots to replace it. The spectacle broke every assumption German planners had relied upon. Where they expected delay, they found determination. Where they anticipated paralysis, they found ingenuity. Captured reports after the war revealed how deeply this shook them. A senior Wehrmacht engineer wrote, We understood at last that the Americans built war as we waged it, continuously. For the Allies, the Rhine crossings marked more than military success. They were proof that industry, organization, and willpower could overcome nature itself. By April 1945, 26 bridges spanned the river, all constructed in a matter of days. Armored divisions streamed eastward, unstoppable. What began as a feat of engineering became the final symbol of Allied inevitability. The river that once divided Europe had been conquered, not by brute force, but by brilliance. When German officers surveyed the aftermath, they found not ruins, but roads. The enemy had not only crossed their river, they had rebuilt it better, and in that realization lay the war's true turning point. The moment Germany's faith in its own invulnerability collapsed. One bridge at a time, the Rhine, once a fortress, had become a monument to the speed and order of an enemy that never stopped building, even while the world burned. When the Rhine crossings were complete, Germany's fate was sealed. What had been meant as a defensive miracle became the grave of a strategy. Every bridge destroyed by retreating engineers now stood reborn, stronger, wider, American. Across them thundered the end of the war. By April 1945, the Allied front stretched unbroken from the North Sea to Switzerland. The Rhine, once thought to guarantee months of resistance, had been crossed in less than 3 weeks. Behind the armored columns rolled a tide of trucks, supply convoys, and field hospitals. Where German staff officers had predicted impassable terrain, U.S. engineers had built highways. In Army reports, generals praised the engineers as the unsung heroes of the Rhine. General Omar Bradley wrote that without them, no army, no matter how brave, could have crossed. Patton called his bridge units the backbone of modern victory. Awards poured in, distinguished service crosses, bronze stars, presidential citations. Yet most engineers returned quietly to their tool, already dismantling temporary spans to reuse in the next advance. Their work didn't end when the battle did. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, engineers rebuilt roads, reconnected railways, and restored water systems to towns shattered by years of bombing. Their skill turned destruction into order, and that order became the foundation of the final drive toward Berlin. For German engineers, the aftermath was bitter. Those who survived captivity were forced to confront a humbling truth. Their enemy had outbuilt them. They had devoted years to perfecting demolition, the science of delay. The Americans had mastered the opposite, the science of progress. Captured officers studied Bailey Bridge, schematics, with the fascination of defeated craftsmen. They called it, structure born of speed. Some even expressed admiration, calling it the weapon that crossed our pride. Civilians, too, felt the difference. In ruined river towns, residents watched as the same bridges they had seen collapse weeks earlier reappeared, section by section, under new flags. Children gathered near the riverbanks to watch U.S. engineers work, astonished at their machines and efficiency. For many Germans, it was their first glimpse of the new order taking shape, one built not by conquest, but by construction. When Allied commanders inspected the completed bridges, they didn't see metal and rivets. They saw the symbol of a nation's industrial might and discipline turned to purpose. In that sense, the Rhine crossings weren't just a tactical triumph, they were the blueprint for peace. For the first time in 6 years of war, Europe was beginning to connect again. As Germany collapsed in April 1945, the bridges that had carried the U.S. Army across the Rhine became symbols of an unstoppable momentum and of a new world taking shape amid the ruins. When the guns finally fell silent in May, the same engineers who had built under fire turned their skills toward rebuilding what war had broken. At Remagen, Oppenheim, Wesel, and countless smaller towns, the Bailey and pontoon bridges remained in use for months after the fighting ended. They became vital arteries for feeding millions of civilians, transporting medical supplies, and evacuating refugees from the bombed cities along the river. Military convoys gave way to columns of relief trucks, and the same hands that once bolted steel under shellfire now helped deliver bread, coal, and blanket. To the Germans, these bridges were a strange sight, enemy structures that restored life instead of taking it. Children played near the riverbanks where tanks had once crossed. Fishermen dropped their lines beneath steel trusses that bore the names of foreign towns. The bridges were no longer weapons, but lifelines. Captured German engineers, now prisoners of war, were often assigned to assist in reconstruction. Some worked side by side with their former adversaries, studying the Bailey design and learning its modular genius. They were astonished by how little equipment the Americans had needed to accomplish so much. In interviews after the war, many admitted that this exposure changed their understanding of engineering itself. One former Wehrmacht captain later said, "They won because they built for movement. We built for monuments." That contrast defined the post-war world. The Allies had proven that flexibility and innovation were stronger than rigidity and pride. In the following years, as West Germany rebuilt its infrastructure, its new engineers, many once soldiers, adopted the very principles that had defeated them. Lightweight prefabrication, modular design, and mobile assembly became the cornerstones of reconstruction across Europe. From NATO bridging systems to modern highway spans, the DNA of the Bailey Bridge lived on. For the United States, the Rhine crossings became legend. Engineer battalions used the experience to develop doctrines that shaped Cold War military planning. The ability to rebuild under fire, to move entire armies across rivers within hours, became the standard by which future conflicts would be measured. Yet, beyond tactics, the story carried a quieter legacy. It showed that the power to build could end wars as surely as the power to destroy. Each bridge across the Rhine became a monument to that idea, not of dominance, but of resilience. By 1946, the temporary spans were slowly dismantled. New permanent bridges, built by both German and Allied crews, rose in their place. Steel replaced rubble. Roads replaced trenches. The Rhine, once the line of division, became a thread of connection again. To those who had witnessed it, the memory remained clear. The night when the Americans built faster than war could destroy, when bridges became the language of victory, and the sound of hammers in the dark foretold the end of an empire. When history speaks of the Second World War, it often remembers the fire, the bombers, the ruins, the screams of conquest and collapse. But amid that storm, there were moments when men chose creation over destruction. The story of the Rhine bridges is one of those moments where humanity built instead of burned. For the German engineers who watched from the far bank, it was more than defeat. It was revelation. They had believed that destruction meant control, that by tearing down, they could dictate the pace of war. But as the smoke lifted and the silhouettes of new bridges rose against the dawn, they saw a truth far more powerful than explosives. Progress cannot be stopped by fear. The Americans didn't conquer the Rhine with force alone. They conquered it with order, coordination, and belief. Belief that even in chaos, discipline and will could create something lasting. Each bridge was more than a structure. It was a statement that the modern world would belong not to those who destroyed, but to those who could rebuild. To the exhausted combat engineers, the achievement was not heroic in the cinematic sense. It was practical, necessary, a day's work in impossible conditions. Yet those days' works changed history. Each beam placed under fire, each cable stretched across black water, became a line in the story of civilization's endurance. The Rhine crossings proved that warfare itself had evolved. Victory was no longer only about courage or numbers. It was about innovation, coordination, and the ability to create amid destruction. It was the triumph of engineers, mechanics, and thinkers, men who fought with tools, not ideology. Today, the Rhine flows quietly beneath modern bridges that carry families, commerce, and peace. Few who cross them remember the nights when they were born in fire. But somewhere in the steel, in the bolts and rivets that still hold firm, lies the echo of that defiance, the sound of hammers striking against war, building the future one bridge at a time.